Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on our Dragonflight DPS rankings. If you can believe it, this is week 10 in season 1, so we'll see how the last few rounds of balance updates about 2 weeks ago actually landed these classes in the PvE styles of content. If you found value in this video, leave a like down below. It helps me out tremendously. Subscribe for more gaming content, and as always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. And we'll start like we always do by looking at last week's numbers. So we're at the end of week 10. This is week 9 at the end of week 9. So a week ago, this is where the DPS classes stacked up in Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and M+. Just so you know, I'm pulling these numbers from the Warcraft logs from the last 2 weeks on all 3 of these different setups. This is for damage output primarily, and this is using the max percentile for damage. Now, there were a bunch of comments, not a bunch, but a couple comments that wanted to see the numbers for slightly less than max, just to see, you know, if it's not the top echelon, how do these stack up? So as a test this week, I'll be doing 95th percentile on DPS. So let me know how you think about this down below in the comments. It'll normalize some of the numbers you'll see, but it does start to shrink some of the differences that you see the lower in percentile you go, and there's definitely a discussion to be had on what percentile is the most accurate and representative of the damage numbers overall. But this week we'll look at 95th percentile, and let's do it. And bam, here we are into week 10. There wasn't really major changes going into this week. We kind of have a little bit of a lull going on. There are some fixes to bugs and some other things that are going out through hot fixes, but we haven't seen any major balance tuning adjustments for any of the classes listed here below. We got some pretty major ones about 2 weeks ago, but nothing this week that really stands out or would be meaningful. And one thing that you can note right off the bat from this is that we do see about the same trends as we did last week with some minor changes. We did see Devastation shoot up in Heroic Raid, and then they started to fall back down again. And it does look like the only place that Devastation Evoker is holding its spot is in Mythic Raid, and then we're seeing those kind of drop down a little bit as well. It's kind of interesting to see if there's big major changes for classes. It does seem like most of the players in the game, especially the higher you are in the upper percentages of playtime, gear, and skill level and availability of other people, like if you're in a competitive guild, you actually see trends of people switching to classes and playing them and showing logs for them when they have major changes. So that's kind of an interesting takeaway from that. But let's go through the list from the top down to the bottom on where the classes stacked up overall in the DPS rankings for week 10. At the very top is Shadow Priest, primarily because of their ridiculous parses in Mythic Raid last week. They were able to just absolutely destroy everyone when it came to just getting ridiculous DPS logs. And they held that in Heroic Raid and Mythic Plus, but to a more reasonable level. You can see that the standard deviation in Mythic Plus is actually not that big at the high end. So you're seeing like you know the top 6 or so being very close. In fact, you can see that Fire down to Shadow are all at about 86 score at just different decimal points of that. So pretty close in Mythic Plus. And then when it comes to Heroic Raid, as always, I like including Heroic Raid because it's a little bit more representative of the average player base. And it's kind of interesting to compare it to Mythic Raid because it's not a fixed group size and you can cheat it. You can cook the books, as I like to say. So you can, you know, set up situations where, you know, you are the only one doing AoE on a big ad pull and everyone else is focusing the boss so that you get these crazy, ridiculous parse numbers, or you underheal a group size that needs more healers, or you solo tank without tank swapping so that you can get crazy blood decay parses. There's ways you can actually get your logs to show very different numbers. So we're seeing that kind of in Heroic Raid. And also I think it actually ends up being a pretty good representation of classes that just parse. They don't really do mechanics as much. A lot of times people in Heroic will skip over mechanics or cheat them in some way. So it's really just, can you put out the numbers? And in Heroic Raid, we saw that that was the case. So Shadow taking overall, they're definitely not in first place, but they're close to the top tier classes in Mythic Plus and Heroic Raid, and they're beating everyone in Mythic Raid. In a fixed group size without any cheats, Shadow is parsing like crazy. In the second spot is Arms for similar reasons. In Raid, Arms has become a bit of a mainstay. Mythic Raid, they've been testing them out a lot more. Arms is kind of coming into the spotlight over the last 2 weeks and standing out a lot more and actually beating Fury in all 3 categories. I believe last week and this week as well. So crazy numbers from Arms. You can say even Heroic Raid, they still parse like crazy. So all the buffs that they got, the 3 or 4 patches of buffs in succession for Arms, had an impact. They definitely helped them. They're in the top order here. They're about average when it comes to Mythic Plus, as are Fury Warriors, a little bit below average. But in Raid, when it comes to parsing and putting out numbers, Arms is doing great right now. So Arms stonks going through the roof. Subtlety Rogue in the 3rd spot overall, primarily because of their Mythic Plus performance. They are still, Subtlety and Outlaw Rogue have just been outperforming everyone when it comes to Mythic Plus. And I think it's interesting, one of the most common M Plus comps for DPS has been Rogue, Balanced Druid, Fire Mage. And finally, for the first time, I think this season, we now see those 3 classes in the top 3 spots for Mythic Plus. So there you go. The original is still there, standing in its spot. Subtlety doesn't perform as well in Heroic Raid, but they do just fine in Mythic Raid. They're actually higher than they were last week at a 95th percentile. So that had an impact on the Rogues coming up a little bit. Didn't help Assassination much, but it did help them move up a little bit in that category. Unholy DK is in the 4th overall slot, primarily because their ability to just do insane damage. If you've been watching the MDI at all, you can see when the pull size is astronomical, so is the DPS output for Unholy DK. Their DPS throughput is just unmatched if they can just stand there and pop Festering Wounds over and over, and they have their cooldowns ready. It's actually ridiculous how much damage they do. It shows that they can do serious damage in Heroic Raid and in Mythic Plus. This is probably one of their better weeks for Mythic Plus. We saw Unholy DK start the season strong, then they kind of went down to average, and then, right after 10.0.5, the first 2 weeks or so, Unholy DK was actually lower than I would have expected for Mythic Plus, but it looks like they have come up just a little bit in that category. Fire Mage is the highest mage spec overall, primarily because of their performance in Mythic Plus. They still parse really well in Heroic Raid, though they are the lowest mage spec in Heroic Raid, and then they're just below average in Mythic Raid. When it comes to doing mechanics and keeping up with other classes, they are doing less so, but in Mythic Plus and Heroic Raid, when damage matters the most, they've got that damage. So there you go. Right underneath Fire Mage is Frost Mage, for similar reasons, primarily because of their Heroic Raid performance. Again, when it comes to just parsing and just standing there and doing numbers and hitting your rotation, they've got good damage. They do below average in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, but honestly, if you're a Frost Mage, I think you'll accept below average in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, considering their start to Season 1 and their middle part of Season 1. Like the first 2 months of Season 1 for Dragonflight Frost Mage was quite rough. They were in the bottom for a while, and like Arms Warrior, they received many consecutive buffs back to back to back that had a noticeable impact. They're actually starting to parse pretty well, but when it comes to switching targets constantly or doing mechanics, they don't stack up as well as some of the other DPS, but they're off the floor of DPS, so they're kind of creeping up on that midline that they were so far away from before. So take that for what you will. I think it's kind of a positive note. Outlaw Rogue underneath Frost Mage, again, primarily because of their Mythic Plus performance. They're still one of the best. AoE, amazing. CC utility, amazing. They can Tricks of the Trade, the tank. They have all kinds. They have Shroud. They work so well in Mythic Plus. That is kind of always going to be the case until they get a kit rework. Mythic Raid, they still parse quite well on 95th percentile, and then they do pretty poorly on Heroic Raid, shockingly. Assassination has kind of been the Heroic Raid champion. They don't do great in Mythic Plus, they don't do great in Mythic Raid, but boy, when they can just ignore everyone, you know, they can put their phone on silent, turn off Discord, and just attack and hit the numbers, hit the buttons. They do just fine, but every other area, that's kind of been the story of Assassination Season 1 Dragonflight. Underneath Outlaw is Havoc Demon Hunter. They actually performed lower than I expected this week in Heroic Raid, still doing just fine in Mythic Raid and great in Mythic Plus. They are very good at clearing trash packs. They have longer cooldowns, but when all those cooldowns are up, they can clear trash, big AoEs, insanely quick. So they're definitely up there when it comes to Mythic Plus clearing, and they're no slouch when it comes to Mythic Raid as well. But when they have to kind of do mechanics, or when it comes to just sitting and parsing, I should say, in Heroic Raid, they don't stack up as well as some of the others, but you know, their mobility allows them to make up for that DPS loss when they're having to switch and do mechanics and play the game as it's meant to be played, right? So there is that. Balanced Druid underneath Havoc, primarily because of their Mythic Plus performance. They are doing above average in Heroic Raid and still pretty poorly in Mythic Raid. I'm curious why this is. I think Balanced Druid has been struggling most of the season in Mythic Raid only. They do amazing in Mythic Plus. They do just fine in Heroic Raid. But for whatever reason, they've been struggling all season in Mythic Raid in kind of keeping up with their compatriots when they go into the 20-man hardest raid difficulty. Underneath Balance's Enhancement, Shaman, they did come down a little bit, partially because they came down this week and also because we dropped the percentile. So I think at the best enhancement shamans tend to be exceptional and better than most specs. But when you start losing the higher echelon, the higher, you know, cream of the crop at the top, enhancement seems to drop quite a lot. So maybe this is more representative for classes like that have that wild swing in variance that, you know, as you go to the median and then slightly up to like 75th percentile, 80, 85, 90, 95, enhancement seems to swap a lot, which is kind of surprising to me. Enhancement tends to be, at least in my opinion, a little more straightforward, but maybe it's just too fast for some people, you know, spamming too hard or not spamming enough. Or maybe you have to spam for too long, right? If it's like an 8-minute boss fight and you're missing globals and buttons and it's too much spam, maybe they can't keep up. But it seems that in 95th percentile, Enhancement Shaman has taken a bit of a blow. Arcane Mage underneath Enhancement, primarily because of their ability to stand still and parse in Heroic Raid. They are the best. They beat out Unholy DK, which in and of itself is an accomplishment. So, you know, good on Arcane Mage for doing that. They do pretty poorly in Mythic Raid, and then they do bottom third in Mythic Plus. So Fire's back on top, baby. We saw the first 2 weeks of Season 1, Arcane Mage was the hotness. In fact, most of the world first clears in Vault and some of the world first high keys had Arcane Mages in them. They were insanely strong, and they've just been on the decline. This is probably their best week in Heroic Raid in a couple weeks, but that didn't really show up when it came to Mythic Plus or in Mythic Raid, where the difficulty is higher. Underneath Arcane is Devastation, about even. Again, we talked about this at the beginning, but Devastation in the top 3 for Mythic Raid. The best of the best that have the perfect group with everything going right. Devastation does amazingly well. Heroic Raid, they're about average, and they're below average in Mythic Plus. They've always had a struggle in Mythic Plus. They were about average in Raid most of the season until they got, you know, several buffs in a row, like some of the other classes did. But they've always struggled in Mythic Plus, and I still maintain my theory that it's primarily because they rely heavily on their long cooldowns. If they don't have their long cooldowns available, if they don't have their Empower spells available, their ability to perform in Mythic Plus is pretty weak. And because Mythic Plus is never ending, you're always constantly pulling and moving and pulling and moving. You know, it's kind of like Ret Paladin. They just can't keep up with some of the other classes. But and partially that could be because of the 95th percentile change, but you let me know what you think. Windwalker in the middle here. They still do amazingly in Mythic Plus. They do above average in Mythic Raid and then slightly below average in Heroic Raid. I think this is pretty accurate. I would think Windwalker is probably a good benchmark for percentile splits. Windwalker, as you manage things better and better, and you make sure your passives are scaling, you're in the right spot, you're even, you know, canceling things and activating things and using Fist of Fury correctly, which is not an easy thing to do for a lot of players, then I would imagine you can get some ceiling out of that to push Windwalker higher, but they're still not, you know, top 3 in any major category. So I kind of expect that if we drop 5% cluster, like cohorts down, Windwalker would drop a little bit as well, but nothing absolutely major. Marksmanship Hunter, the first hunter we've encountered on this list for the overall scoring, that is. They are a little bit higher than usual because they're doing much better in Mythic Raid. I think this is because everyone's trying out the hunters after the 5% buff, but we can see that no hunters are at the very bottom of any of the lists. So that 5% buff seemed to have been enough. Shockingly, so marksmanship doing pretty good in Mythic Raid, about below average in Heroic Raid, and then about average in Mythic Plus, which helps them come up off the ground. When they lost that double tap change and their talents moved around, it actually hurt them quite a lot. They dropped off pretty hard. Underneath the marksmanship is Feral Druid. Feral Druid benefited tremendously from going to the 95th percentile, so they came up a lot. They actually had a really great week 1, and since then they just haven't been heard of much. They've been kind of in the middle of the pack, just doing their thing. On the highest percentiles, the best performance, Feral seems to struggle against other classes, but on the lower 95th percentile, they do a little bit better. They're still not, cream of the crop, not at the top, but they're definitely in the upper third, above half for Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus. But their major problem this week it was in Heroic Raid. So their ability to deal damage and parse like everyone else, like if it's a training dummy exercise where you just stand and attack a target to see who does the most damage, it ain't Feral right now. But when things have to be utilized and they have to move and do mechanics and play along and rotation at the same time, they do okay, all things considered. Fairy Warrior underneath Feral in the overall. They did better this week in Mythic Raid and much lower in Heroic Raid. They are below average in Mythic Plus, but towards the bottom in Heroic Raid. The challenge with this is, and I've said this for a couple weeks now since we do this every week, but I wonder if it's set bonus. I wonder if the Fury set bonus just doesn't provide enough. It's usually, historically, Fury Warrior tends to scale really well with optimal gear. As they get the best, they hit all their breakpoints perfectly. They can get as much possible, verse and haste, and they stack all the stats together. They keep getting better and better, kind of like Shadow Priest, but we just haven't seen that this season at all. Fury Warrior started out in the top 5, and then they just quickly became in the middle of the pack, and they've been slipping. Even with the buff, like they weren't going to get a buff. Arms was the focus of the buffs. Then they ended up getting a little bit of a buff anyways, and it helped them slightly, but they're still, when it comes to Mythic Plus and Heroic Raid, towards the lower end. But Mythic Raid, people brought their warriors last week or this week, and they went to town and they did okay. So maybe there's hope, but you really have to work at it, it seems. It doesn't really come as free as it does for other classes. Demonology Warlock is the highest of the 3 Warlock specs right now. They did get a minor buff. They got some cleanups in the last patch, and they had some kind of minor buffs in the hot fixes that they got, which seemed to be okay. They're doing about average in Mythic Raid, towards the bottom in Heroic Raid, and below average in Mythic Plus. So they really haven't recovered too much from their initial start. They kind of fell down. And there were some kind of questions on if they're too strong, but time took advantage of them, and slowly they didn't recover from that. Destruction Warlock is below Demonology. This has kind of been the story for Destruction ever since the beginning. They have always done well in Mythic Plus. Always. They are exceptionally good in Mythic Plus. And in fact, this week they were the best performing Warlock spec in Mythic Plus, period. They do pretty horrible in Mythic Raid. They're second to last. They're down there with Elemental Shaman and Assassination Rogue, which is not the best company considering where things are right now. But, it makes sense. I mean, maybe it's a cleave problem. If they have multiple targets, Destruction kind of falls apart. Or maybe they just need really big pulls, and they can manage their resources properly to keep the fire coming down from above. I'm not sure, but they do great in Mythic Plus and not so great in Raid currently. Beast Mastery underneath Destruction, they did come up after the buffs that they received. The buffs they received didn't seem to help them too much in Mythic Plus, but it did actually have a meaningful impact for them in Mythic Raid, and they actually parsed pretty well in Heroic Raid, which tells you that they can do the damage. it just, maybe it is a little bit too hard to get to with where they are right now. Assassination Rogue escapes the lower end of the list again just because of heroic raid parses. On 95th percentile, their parse was actually lower than before, which you'd expect that. And then when the drop's even lower, Mythic Raid, they were dead last, and then Mythic Plus, they were in the bottom 6. So I think they're kind of that point. I think Assassination Rogue right now is just the Blizzard's focus is on PvP for them. PvE, they seem to do pretty good in heroic raid if they're if they're well prepared and they're well statted and they know their rotation and they're doing everything right. They can do some serious damage, but outside of that, they seem to be struggling comparatively to the other two rogue specializations. Affliction Warlock is not at the bottom, so they got a damage buff. They got a little bit of a cleanup on some of their abilities as well. I would say 10.0.5 was good, but I think they have even better changes coming in 10.0.7. I'm super excited about that. So we'll see how that affects them. But for now, they can parse really well in Heroic Raid, which is good news. They actually, even in Heroic Raid, weren't doing that well. Like they couldn't even deal damage when they were able to deal damage. And then in difficult content, they struggle quite a lot. I think the challenge with Affliction is I don't think it's possible to get your haste to a point while also getting mastery high enough to deal damage that you can get through all the globals. I think the problem with Affliction, in playing mine anyway, is that they just have so many globals they have to get through that if it's a short fight, they do absolutely nothing. If it's a long fight, they do okay, but it depends on the encounter itself. So possibly people are clearing Mythic Raid fast and they're struggling with that. And then obviously in Mythic Plus, they have Seed of Corruption, Vile Taint, and they've got Shadow Fury, I guess. And then Death Glare has good AoE, even better AoE, I think, coming in 10.0.7. So again, I'm just excited to see where they land after those changes in the upcoming patch. Survival Hunter in the bottom 4. They did come up off the floor for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks in a row. They were dead last in all 3 categories. So that 5% buff for them and for their pet output had a nice trend up. And one of the encouraging things that I'll point you to right now is that if you look at one of the higher level things you want to think about is look at the bars on the right side of the screen, and there's always going to be a curve. You want that curve to be as smooth as possible. You never want classes to have this huge jut where there's like a deviation or more from the class that's above them. You never want them to be significantly ahead or significantly behind from the people that are directly adjacent to them on that list. And I think they've smoothed out the list a lot. There were plenty of times in season 1 where we saw big chunks, like in the bottom 2, they were just way behind everyone else, or at the top, they were way ahead. And I think they've done a pretty good job of smoothing out that line so that there's not these major discrepancies. Now, there is a discrepancy, right? If you compare this week Elemental Shaman to Shadow Priest overall, there's a very serious divide there. But the smoothness, I think, is much better than it's been, and probably the best it's been since the start of the season, around about now after 10.0.5. So pretty good there. So Retribution Paladin is in the bottom 3. They were hurt really bad by going from max percentile to 95th percentile. It hurt them so bad. It fell really hard, which tells you that maybe they're right on the money about Retribution having a low survival rate. Maybe they die too much. You were required to do everything perfectly, pay attention perfectly, self-heal yourself, bring red pots and keep yourself alive and things like that. And then they're just kind of struggling to parse because they're dying, or maybe they just can't do the damage output. I'm shocked to see in Heroic Raid, Retribution Paladin in the second to last position. I think, yeah, I'm not sure why they're so far down. I'm not shocked to see Mythic Plus. I feel like in Dragonflight, Retribution Paladin has always struggled in moving clumps of mobs. In 10.0.7, they have some amazing changes that should make their AoE a lot more flexible and on demand. And they have tons of new ways to get holy power, which was always a drain for them. So hopefully this helps clean them up. They're still doing about average in Mythic Raid, even on the lower percentile, but they're struggling a lot in Heroic Raid and in Mythic Plus. Frost DK do okay in Mythic Raid. They're in the top, what is that, top 8. They're in the bottom 3 for Heroic Raid, and the absolute bottom for Mythic Plus, which tells you, this is probably going to get worse and worse as the percentiles go lower. But there's something about Frost Decay that the majority of the player base is not clicking with. They're not hitting it. It's not making sense. Or they're just not doing enough. The highest percentile people with a perfect group size that know exactly what we're doing, they have everything backing them properly, they tend to do all right. I've seen plenty of Frost Decays absolutely slay, but on mass, law of large numbers, they're just not doing great. And hopefully the changes that we're seeing for them in 10.1.7 will help with that. I'm not convinced that it will, considering that the wrap sheet or the update sheet that we have right now for 10.1.7, but it's ongoing. Maybe there's more coming for Frost Decay. We'll see. Towards the bottom, or at the bottom, is Elemental Shaman, primarily because of their raid performance. They do bottom third or so for Mythic Plus. They actually have fantastic AoE. If they're spec'd for AoE and statted for AoE, which you can kind of confidently do in Mythic Plus, especially for fortified weeks, because you're going to be spending more effort on trash than on bosses, you can easily get some pretty decent clear times. Their AoE is actually pretty substantial and respectable. They just have trouble in raid. And maybe that's because, we've talked about this before on the channel of Elemental Shamans having like 5 different builds that all do different things, and they have no overlap, right? So you can spec for single target, you can spec for 2-man cleave, you can spec for 3+ AoE, you can spec for mass pulling, but they're all different specs and they're all different stat weights and they require different builds. And there's no style of content that you can do currently that only has one of those things and exclusively one of those things. So you kind of have to pick and choose. And I guess in single target, they're just really struggling. I would say they maybe, I don't know. Maybe they just need some love for single target, and that will help raise their Mythic Plus performance. Again, they do okay in Mythic Plus, and honestly, none of these classes right now they can all do up to plus 20 keys. They can all do Mythic raid clears. I think that there's no one that's too far behind that can't do that. And a lot of it comes down to player skill as well. So if you get a good player on any of these classes, they're going to do excellent, if not the best, just because all these classes can perform. This is just looking at trends and overall numbers. So those are the numbers and the rankings for week 10. Let me know what your thoughts are, and let me know what you think about going from max percentile to 95th. I'm sure there's going to be a whole discussion around that, but just kind of curious to see what your thoughts are. If you like the video, you found value in it, leave a like down below. Subscribe for more gaming content. And as always, if you have any questions or comments for me, I'm live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. You could probably come talk to me right now. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.